Before I forget this, I just counted and I'm almost positive I reread 72 books this year. So with that said, in today's video, I wanted to tell you about all the books that I reread this year. At the beginning of this year, I did make a video where I talked about a couple of books that I would love to reread this year, because last year I did not reread a lot of books and I kind of wanted to make it a mission to do that this year. And what did I just say? 72 books? Yeah, I think I did it. Before we get started though, I feel like I should mention a couple of things. So first of all, I am very happy that I ended up rereading the majority of the books that I told myself I wanted to reread at the beginning of the year. I didn't get to all of them, but it's okay because I ended up rereading a lot of different ones that I wasn't expecting to reread, and I ended up having a really great rereading experience over the course of the past 12 months or so. And then on top of that, I'm not necessarily going to be telling you any of these books in a particular order. I literally grabbed them off my shelf and they're not in the order in which I read them or anything like that. We're just going by the stacks that are randomly in front of me. And then I do have a lot of books that I'm very happy that I reread. And then there are also a couple of books that ended up letting me down the second time around. So I feel like I wanted to tell you that so you have something interesting to look forward to, because we have a lot of books to go through. And then lastly, I'm not actually going to be telling you about the synopsis of any of these books because we have so many to talk about, and I don't really want to waste the time explaining what these books are actually about. I feel like I've talked about them very often in a lot of my other videos. So today I just want to rehash my experience of how it was to reread all of them. So with that said, first up, I have the Throne of Glass series and then the Akatar series. So I did my third round of rereading this series, of all time. I only reread it once this year, but it was the third time that I reread this series. And then I did a third and fourth round of rereading this series this year. So I actually went through this entire series twice. Well, technically I didn't go through it twice, because the first time that I did a reread of this series, I did reread all of the books. And then the second time around, which was pretty recently, I did it a month or two ago, I randomly got the urge to just revisit Akmap specifically. But I'm if I'm gonna do that, I should just revisit the entirety of Fae Sand's story. So I ended up only doing a reread of the first 4 books. So technically I've only read A Court of Silver Flames twice, even though I have now read this series 4 times. It makes sense if you think about it, but either way, the details don't really matter. My point is that I love these series to death, and I did a reread of this series, and then I did 2 rereads of this series this past year, and another round of rereading this series is honestly coming very soon, but it probably won't happen until the beginning of next year, but I'm getting the urge again. Next up, I did an entire reread of the Harry Potter series. So thing is I don't know if I could 100% consider this to be an actual reread, because the first time that I read this series, I was 12 years old, and I haven't revisited the actual books since, even though I've read the movie, watched the movies a million times, and I feel like I've read the books 1,000 times, even though I 100% haven't. But either way, this past year, I finally did end up revisiting the actual books, and I'm really happy that I did that, because the first couple books, they were extremely similar to the movie. So I'm I don't really want to waste my time with this. I'm literally just rewatching the movie, but in my head, without the visuals, and it kind of sucked. But then as we got later into the books, I really ended up enjoying the differences and everything else that was added on into the books that we didn't end up getting to the movies that I completely forgot about. I did read the series one time, so everything was familiar, but every time I got to something that I didn't see in the movies, I'm oh my God, I forgot that it's so much better in the books. And I'm really happy that I ended up revisiting this in book format, especially because I was trying to do a reread of this for the past 2 years or so, and I kept just pushing it off, not being in the mood, and then I finally did it this year. So I feel I really checked something off of my list. The next universe that I decided to revisit this past year was the Shadowhunter universe. So I did end up doing a reread of the entire Mortal Instruments series. So that was a collection of 6 books. And then I did revisit the Red Scrolls of Magic as well as the Lost Book of the White. I did rereads of all of the short stories. So the Bane Chronicles, Shadowhunter Academy, as well as Ghosts from the Shadow Market. And I also reread the Dark Artifices series. So I basically reread almost all the books in the universe. I didn't go back to the Clockwork series or the Last Hour series. And my reasoning for that was because I know that the 3rd book in the Last Hour series is coming out pretty soon, and I'm not gonna want to do another round of rereading those books when the next book comes out. So I kind of saved it, and I'll just reread it so that I could binge all 3 of them together. And then I just kind of saved the Clockwork because I feel I'm gonna just want to do a reread of that when I'm rereading the Last Hour. So we put those on the side for now. And this past year, I basically reread all of the books besides for those books, and I had such a freaking great time with doing this series. I really wasn't expecting to do it. It wasn't in my head at all. And then very randomly, I'm you know what? I want to revisit the Shadowhunter series. And then I ended up doing it, and oh my God, I had a great time with it. I'm pretty sure that I did it probably around 6 months ago or so. Not that it really matters, but I have a very vivid memory of listening to one of the Mortal Instrument books while I was in the airport going to Book Bonanza. And I don't know why that memory sticks out to me so clearly, but I just remembered that. So I must have done this at the beginning of the summer of sorts. And I'm already feeling I can go and revisit all of these books again. Not that I think I'm going to, but I feel next year I honestly might do it again. And then another series that I extremely randomly decided to revisit this past year was the Raven Cycle series by Maggie Steve Waters. So it is a collection of 4 books. It's all YA, and I loved this series the first time that I read it. I know that there's a lot of like mixed feelings towards this series, but it's like a comfort thing for me, you know? Like I go back to these characters and I'm like, this is just, I love hanging out with them sort of thing. And I did do a reread of this, I'm pretty sure at the beginning of January of sorts. So it's been a while, but I just very vividly remember doing my reread of this, and honestly, I feel like I can already do it again. The next book that I wanted to share with you, I feel like I just talked about in another one of my videos, but for the life of me, I cannot remember why I was talking about it. But not that it really matters, because I'm gonna have to repeat myself anyway, because we have to talk about it in this video. And that series is the From Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So I had reread the first 3 books this year. I had read them for the first time the year before. And then when the 4th book was coming out, I wanted to catch myself up on everything that was going on in the world so that I can go into the 4th book with like a very fresh mind of sorts. And unfortunately, when I did my reread, I realized I absolutely hate this series for so many reasons. I'm honestly not going to repeat myself here, because I honestly feel like I just talked about this in another video, and hopefully you guys have watched that, so you already know my stance on how I feel about the From Blood and Ash series. But either way, second time around, definitely not as good, and I'm honestly a little bit embarrassed that I loved it as much as I did the first time that I read it. But anyway, the next series that I wanted to share with you is the Shadowfall series by C.C. Hunter. So this is a collection of 5 books, and I did try rereading it this past year, but unfortunately I ended up DNFing it very early on to the first book. So I'm holding up like a bind of the first 2 books. So Born at Midnight is the first book. Ended up DNFing it probably like, I don't know, 20% in. I can't even remember, because it just was not working for me like this time around. I had read this series for the first time years and years ago, probably like 7-8 years ago. I very vividly even remember where I was sitting and how much I enjoyed it at the time that I had read it for the first time. But when I was an adult, as in like this past year, and I tried going back to it because I'm like, oh, I want to like, you know, go and revisit a childhood favorite. I haven't touched this book in years, never really even think about it, but I remember loving it, you know, at the time that I read it. So I went back to it, and then, oh my God, it was just so much worse than I remember it being. And what's funny is that I'm pretty sure my sister, like my little sister, she tried rereading this series as well, and even she didn't like it the second time around, and she is way less picky than me. But I just really wasn't enjoying the writing style this time. It was like too YA for me. The main character was like way too petty, and I couldn't bring myself down to the level that these characters were at. I don't know where I was at in my life like 8 years ago to actually enjoy this book for what it was, but this time around, did not enjoy it as much. Anyway, the next series that I wanted to talk about is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. So this is actually one of the first series that I ended up picking up when I got myself back into reading a couple of years ago. I was obsessed with this at the time. I made all of my siblings read it. None of them enjoyed it as much as me, but I loved it, and I was just like raving about it left and right. I loved the show. I loved the books. Like everything about it, was obsessed for a while there. And then I really wanted to go and revisit it this past year. I'm like, you know what? Enough time has passed. Let's go back to a series that I had considered my favorite. And unfortunately, it was not as good the second time around. I honestly think that it's just because I'm not very into like my fantasy era anymore, and this is very heavy on like world building and information, and it's just got a specific vibe, and I think I honestly might have like picked it up at the wrong time, and I kind of like forced myself through it. But then honestly, on top of that, the romance was not as good as I remember it being. Like I remember being absolutely obsessed with this like forbidden vampire to witch sort of romance thing, and then the second time that I read it, I was like, this is way more like insta-lovey and like insta attraction sort of vibes than I remember it being, and I just couldn't, like I didn't enjoy it as much a second time around. So I actually never ended up continuing with the second and the third book. I liked the vibes of the story. I still have good feelings towards it, but I think that I'm just gonna like somewhat leave it in my past. Maybe I'll try to revisit it again a different time, but like honestly, like it just wasn't working out for me again when I went and revisited this past year. So I just like left it after book 1. Oh my God, it just came back to me. I remember now where I talked about the From Blood and Ash series recently. It was in my Do I Still Love My Favorite Reads from Last Year video. And why I just remembered that was because the next step I wanted to talk about not the Hunger Games. Why was I about to say the Hunger Games? It's The Hating Game and then The Spanish Love Deception. And I was like, I just recently talked about these 2 books too. And it was in that video because these 2 books were actually on my favorite reads from last year. And then I decided to go and revisit them this past year. And unfortunately, they did not work out the second time around. So that's all I'm going to say on that, because I did just talk about it in a recent video. And that video will be linked down below in case you want to hear details about why I didn't love these 2 books the second time around, as well as the From Blood and Ash series. Next up, I also did a reread of The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hong. So this was a very random reread for me. And when I reread it, I'm like, I now regret not putting this on my favorite reads of last year. I love this book so much. And I think I had just read it like way too early on in the year before. I'm pretty sure I read it like January, February time of 2021. Does that make sense? So by the time that I got to the end of last year, I just kind of like, I was too far gone from this book that I didn't remember it being as good as it was. But then extremely randomly, randomly, I'm like, you know what? I'm kind of down to revisit this story. And I did it like a couple months ago. And oh my God, did I love it. And I'm so happy that I revisited. I'm literally like ready to go and do another reread of this already. So that will probably be on my list for rereads of 2023. But either way, read this for a second time this past year. And I am so happy that I did that. Next up, I have The Fox and the Hound by R.S. Gray. So I have read a lot of R.S. Gray books. Like last year, I think I read like 7 or 8 books of hers, and I really enjoyed them at the time that I read them. And the only reason why I randomly decided to re-pick up this book out of all of the ones that I've read and enjoyed was because I was able to get it via audio from my library. Like I really enjoy rereading books via audio because I'm already very familiar with the story. So if I read it via audio and then I miss like a moment here or there, it's like I'm not really missing it because I've already read it and I'm already familiar with the story. Does that make sense? So either way, the only reason why I decided to pick this book up again was because it was available for free via my library. And I am happy that I revisited it. I will say that it was not as good the second time around, but it still was enjoyable, and it still is a book that I would definitely recommend if you're like down for this storyline. It's very easy, quick rom-com, just like a good time. Wasn't as good as the first time, but still a good time. And then I also reread Boss Man by V. Keeland for the same reason as The Fox and the Hound, because I was able to get it via my library and I really enjoyed it the first time that I read it. So I revisited it via audio when I had the opportunity. And honestly, just as good the second time around. So happy that I revisited this. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded if I had done it with my eyes because this was on, I'm pretty sure, my favorite list from like 2021. Like it was one of my favorite books from last year. And that was one of the reasons why I was like, oh, I saw it via audio, gonna read that, no questions asked. And then I really enjoyed it the second time around. So wouldn't have even minded if I ended up spending my time physically rereading it. I didn't do that, but I would have. Next up, I have Meet You in the Middle by Devin Daniels. So I feel like I just talked about this book in a recent video of mine as well, and I just cannot remember which video it is, but either way, I did do a reread of it this past year, and I am very happy that I did that. I gave this book 5 stars the first time that I read it. Never saw anybody talk about it, never really like seen it around before. I randomly saw it in a store, just picked it up, ended up being amazing. And this past year when I was like really into like, okay, like let me read a bunch of like my favorite standalones, like this was just one that I decided to pick up because I'm like, was it just like an in the moment thing, or was this book really as good as I remember it being? And then yes, it ended up being as good as I remember it being. Highly recommend this one. And Enemies to Lovers, super underrated. I just freaking loved it. This next book is Forbidden by Carl Sorensen. So this book I actually read for the first time this year, and then I even did a reread of it probably like 6 months later or so. I had found Carl Sorensen this past year, and I slowly was going down her backlog. I ended up reading the majority of her books this year. I only have a couple that I still haven't read, and I'm pretty sure this one is my favorite. I mean, it's probably my favorite because it's the only one that I ended up revisiting, but I would be super down to revisit a handful more of her books, but this one still, I believe, will probably always be my favorite of hers. I loved everything about it. I'm also almost positive this is the first one that I read by her. I could be wrong about that, but either way, it was the first one that I read by her, ended up being my favorite out of all the ones I read by her, reread it this past year, and was just as good the second time around. And then I also revisited Josh and Hale's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. So I feel like I talk about this book a lot because it just has a very special place in my heart. This is the first adult contemporary romance book that I ever read, and I now officially believe I read it either 3 or 4 times. I know that I read it twice this year, but I'm not sure if I read it only for the first time the year before or if I somehow did a reread of it the year before because I had read it the year before that, and now this year I somehow visited it twice. I honestly don't know, and I forgot to look it up before I started making this video, but it doesn't really matter. My point is that I've read this book either 3 or 4 times, and I definitely read it twice this past year alone, and it was just as good every single time. I love this book. I'm gonna love this book forever, and I don't think my feelings will ever change on this one. I also ended up rereading The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. So this is a book that I had read for the first time last year. And I remember at that time that I read it, I was like, oh my God, I absolutely love it. But I was very into Christina Lauren at the time. So when I was deciding to like, reread a couple of books this past year, I'm like, you know what? I should revisit this one because I remember enjoying it, but will I like it just as much the second time around? And I'm happy to say that I did. This book was probably like better the second time around. Well, it probably wasn't better. It was just as good the first time, but I kind of forgot how much I loved it because I had read it such a long time ago. And then when I revisited it, I'm like, oh my God, this book is amazing, and I'm so happy that I decided to revisit it. Next up, I have Vicious by L.J. Shen. So I actually reread this book twice this year. I had read this for the first time, I think like a little bit over a year and a half ago, like sometime over last summer. And then 6 months or so right after that, I decided to reread this book. And that was at the beginning of January because I had put this book on my favorite list of 2021. Like it was one of my favorite books from last year. So right at the beginning of the year, I was just like in the mood to revisit it. And I loved it just as much the second time around. And then sometime over the summer, I ended up getting the audiobook version of this for like $2 $2 or so. I just like randomly came across it on sale and I'm like, you know what? I've read this book twice. I absolutely love it. I do consider it one of my favorites. So let's get it via audio. And then I ended up rereading it via audio. So that was like the second time that I reread it, and it was just as good the third time around. So I am so happy to say that I did put this book on my favorite list of 2021, and it is still one of my favorite books after reading it 3 times. And then the same story goes for The Deal and The Chase by Elle Kennedy. So this is the first book in the Off-Campus series. This is the first book in the Briar series, which is a spin-off from the Off-Campus series, just in case you're not familiar. But either way, I had found both of these audiobooks on sale for like $2 a piece. So I just randomly decided to get it because I remember really enjoying both of these books at the time that I read it. And The Deal was actually a book that I had in mind to reread this past year. So I'm very happy that I ended up doing that. The Chase wasn't necessarily on my list, but because I found it on sale via audio, I'm like, you know what? Let's do a reread of it. And that is exactly what I did. And I'm very happy to say that both of these lived up to my memory, and I enjoyed them just as much the second time around. Okay, and this is probably very stupid of me, but I currently have all the books that we talked about sitting in a pile because all of these books I want to talk about very quickly, and I just could not hold them up. So we are talking about all my favorite Mariana Zapata books that I reread this past year. So this is a collection of all of the books that I am literally willing to reread by her. She has like 13 books out. I've read every single one of them, and these are the ones that, you know, I absolutely love. So this past year, I actually did 2 and 3 rounds of rereading these books. So let me explain. Let's do one by one. From Look Over Love, I read for the first time this past year, and I ended up doing 1 round of rereading it. So I read From Look Over Love twice this year. Same goes for Dear Aaron, and then Luna and the Lie and Wait for It. I had read for the first time this year, and I ended up rereading them twice more this year. So I read these books 3 times this year, and then happens to be The Wall of Winnipeg. I read it twice this year, but I had read it for the first time the year before. So I've now read The Wall of Winnipeg 3 times, like, you know, like in my entire lifetime, but I read it twice this past year. Hopefully that's not too confusing. And then All Roads Lead Here, I had reread once this year. I had read it for the first time the year before, and I really do want to do another round of rereading this one. It's probably going to come soon. I don't know if I'll make it before the technical end of, like, you know, 2022, but I will hopefully be rereading this for a 3rd time very, very soon. And then same goes for Culty and Under Lock. I happen to have read Culty for the first time the year before, so I did 1 round of rereading Culty this past year, but hopefully I will be doing a 2nd round of rereading it very, very soon. And then Under Lock is one that I have read twice this year. I read it for the first time this past year, and then I did a reread of it, and then I want to reread it again very, very soon. So hopefully I will do a 3rd round of rereading this one very soon, and then probably by the time I finish, you know, rereading these 3, I'll go back and reread these 2 for the 3rd time. So I'm currently on a mission to reread these all at least 3 times, and soon I will be starting my 4th. Basically, I love Mariana Zapata. These are some of my favorite books of all time. I highly recommend every single one of them, and I have read each of them multiple times this past year. I'm happy to say that I did not drop any of the books while I was taking down that little stack. But either way, that is all the books that I wanted to share with you for today's video. So I hope you enjoyed seeing all the books that I ended up rereading this past year. I honestly am extremely surprised by the amount of rereads that I did. I really did not expect to reread, what did I say at the beginning of this video? Like 72 books. I feel like that is more books than some people read alone in a year. And I had done rereads of those, and then I read so many more books on top of that. So I am really happy with all of the books that I decided to revisit. Even if they didn't work out the second time around, I'm still happy that I revisited them to see how my tastes have changed over time. So I'm curious to know if you're a fan of rereading books or not. I know it's not for everybody. Some people just like, you know, it's a one and done situation, but if you are a fan of rereading books, I'd love to hear what books you love to reread. So leave me a comment down below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But either way, just thank you for watching my video because I really appreciate that. So with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.